So last week I was in Los Angeles for E3 2019. I was on the floor and got to meet a lot of amazing people and got to play many of the games on the floor. But one of the biggest draws for me while being at E3 was to take a closer look at the emulation device known as the Polymega. For those who may not be familiar with this product, Polymega is a retro emulation device meant for the living room that in itself isn't very different from other emulation boxes, but Polymega's focus is to cater to those who own physical copies of their games and want to revisit them in a modern HD era. Polymega started its life known as RetroBlocks and was revealed all the way back in early 2017. RetroBlocks was a modular retro gaming console that came stock with an optical drive and supported both PlayStation 1 and Sega CD out of the box. From here, you can add additional add-on modules to allow for both cartridge-based compatibility, such as NES, Super NES, Sega Genesis, and TurboGrafx. Now, I did mention retro emulation device, but that wasn't always the case. Originally, the Polymega was advertised as utilizing FPGA inside the base hardware itself, and that got many people excited. Then back in September of 2018, pre-orders opened up for the system. Right before this launch, Polymega announced that the FPGA had been moved out of the console itself and into select modules. But they also added Sega Saturn emulation as a bonus. The removal of FPGA right at the pre-order stage upset some people, and the Sega Saturn emulation was scrutinized heavily as something that would not run very well at all. This was compounded further when footage of the arcade version of Sega Rally was shown accidentally for the Sega Saturn gameplay. It's fair to say that mistakes were made. But since then, Polymega has come back strong. They've demonstrated both with direct gameplay captures of their Sega Saturn emulation, which looks impressive. They've also attended live shows and let people try the product out for themselves. It's something that they stand behind. So I do want to mention before we proceed that I have pre-ordered my own Polymega system out of my own money for $299. So I want to make sure that, none of you feel like that this video is sponsored or Polymega reached out to me to make this video. This is definitely something that I want to show you guys and show you my experiences with the product, especially as someone who is pre-ordering their own unit. Now, the other thing I want to say is I was one of those detractors and haters back in the early part of this year when all this stuff was going down with the Polymega public relations nightmare that they were having on Twitter and other social media. But I do want to mention that Polymega has responded to that very well and come back with an emulation-based product that is actually quite impressive. So first of all, let's understand the technical specifications of the Polymega, because there's quite a bit of misinformation going around that this is nothing but a Raspberry Pi based or Android device. In reality, Polymega is an Intel x68 based system. It's running a Pentium Gold G5400T that comes with 4 hardware threads and runs at 3.1 GHz. The GPU is an integrated Intel HD Graphics 610. The storage is a 32GB onboard nano SSD, which is expandable on the slot at the bottom of the box or the micro SD card on the back. So for all intents and purposes, this is a low-spec PC, which for an emulation box makes sense, and on paper it has enough horsepower to run Sega Saturn emulation. Initially, Polymega did not want to reveal what emulation was being used, but when I spoke to CEO Brian Burnell, he confirmed that they have licensed some of the best emulators around, starting with Mednafen, a portable multi-system emulator. Mednafen is licensed by Polymega and manages the Sega Saturn, Super NES, PlayStation 1, and PC Engine. For NES emulation, there is a licensed version of Messen, and for Neo Geo CD, MAME is used under 3-clause BSD license, but the YM206010 sound emulation, which is GPL, was completely rewritten. The Sega Genesis, Sega CD, and 32X emulation is using Kega Fusion. For those that may remember, Kega Fusion is a closed-source emulator that's been discontinued for years. It was developed by legendary emulation author Steve Snake, who has since returned and is exclusively developing updates for Kega Fusion for the Polymega. When I asked Brian about this, he mentioned that one of the Polymega development team had worked with Steve on other commercial projects, and Steve was asked if he would dust off the Kega Fusion code and integrate it into Polymega. And it's awesome to see one of the best developers for Sega Genesis emulation has returned to the fold to work on this project. When it comes to CD-based emulation such as Sega Saturn, PlayStation 1 and Neo Geo CD, all of them require licensed BIOSes to run which cannot be provided by the hardware. For this, Brian brought in Theo Burkow, who was the original developer of the Sega Saturn Yabause emulator. Theo implemented both the PlayStation 1 and Sega Saturn BIOS replacements as well as general improvements such as Neo Geo CD load time speedups, which is very impressive to see firsthand. So now that we've covered both the hardware specs and the emulation side, how does the Polymega actually perform? Sega Saturn emulation was the standout for me. I was quite skeptical of the level of accuracy and performance, but I tested quite a few games at the Polymega booth and it was very impressive. With both Theo and Mednafen development teams on board, this emulation is in good hands.
Passing the checkpoint!
Wow. Head towards sector D102 where the plant site is located. Reed?
Speed machine has been destroyed. I've secured this area. Rangers, use extreme caution.
The Polymega also supports save states and IPS patches for any English translations necessary. When I asked how the CD emulation worked, if it was a true optical drive replacement, or if the CD just makes an ISO image of the game and the emulator loads the image off SSD storage, Brian let me know that the ISO image is created on the fly during the first loading of the game, and once the ISO image is 100% extracted onto the SSD, it will use that for any subsequent loads. I have no problem saying that I've gone from a skeptic to a believer. Even with the rough and rocky start, the Polymega team has come up with a product which is quite impressive overall, and one that I really like. But I will reserve my full judgment and recommendation until the final version of the product is released later this year. So in conclusion, I really liked what I saw of the Polymega product at E3 2019. I thought everything ran really well. The emulation was very, very good, especially for Sega Saturn. I was quite impressed with that. I felt like it was going to be less compatible than I originally thought, but we tried a bunch of different games and everything seemed to run very, very well. I didn't really get a sense of any input lag while I was playing through the Polymega system with the different systems. Now, I also want to be very clear that I had no way of measuring it at the show because I didn't have any equipment with me to do so. It's really just, the feel that I had comparing it to original hardware, especially on an LCD display. But I thought that the input lag was acceptable. I don't exactly know how many frames it was. I'm sure that someone like RGB Bob can fill me in on what that would be, but I thought it was definitely acceptable and I had no issues there whatsoever. The other thing I really liked was the snappiness of the user interface. When you insert a new game into the drive, it didn't take very long for it to get recognized by the system itself and then jump into launching the game. So I thought that was a really cool feature. As far as adding the the different emulation boxes or the modules as they call them, that was very fast and snappy as well. We hot swapped some cartridges in and out and that seemed to work very well too. So I was very, very happy with the product. It's quite mature and it's something that's been around and in development for a long time, and it really, really shows. This is not something that the company is out to make a quick buck on. They really have spent a lot of time and they have some amazing people behind the scenes working on this stuff, including Steve Snake, who's come back exclusively for Polymega with the Kega Fusion emulation. And that's one thing that I do want to mention is that the Sega sound emulation, or the Genesis emulation, the sound emulation in the Genesis, I should say, was a little off for me. It wasn't quite right. And, I think some other folks had mentioned that as well, that the sound was just a little off. But, with Steve Snake back in the fold and actively developing the Kega Fusion emulator again, I feel like that's something that will be addressed. Hopefully we'll see that addressed before launch. But, I really think that's probably the main criticism that I took away from the Polymega at the show. Now, I'm not going to say there's other issues. There may be other issues, but once I get a hold of the hardware later on this year, as mentioned, I did pre-order a Polymega system myself, so we'll be definitely dissecting this a lot further on the channel and really, putting it under the microscope and taking a closer look at the system and really see if it's something that's worth, the $299 price of admission. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed this look at the Polymega system. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. I want to hear your thoughts. Have I changed your mind at all? Are you going to pick one up now, or are you still on the fence, or you're just going to stick to original hardware, or just emulation on a Raspberry Pi? I mean, all those options are quite valid, but I want to hear your thoughts, what you think about this product, and let me know in the comments below. Well guys, that will do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, you know what to do. Give me a thumbs up, and as always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.